Angela Duckworth is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania and a 2013 MacArthur Fellow. Angela studies non-IQ competencies, including self-control and grit, a term with which she's very highly identified, which predicts success both academically and professionally. Her research populations, I love this, have included West Point cadets, National Spelling Bee finalists, novice teachers, salespeople, and students. Duckworth received a BA in neurobiology from Harvard in 1992, and as a Marshall Scholar, a master's in neuroscience from Oxford. She completed her PhD in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to her career in research, Angela founded a nonprofit summer school for low-income children, which won the Better Government Award for the state of Massachusetts and was profiled as a Harvard Kennedy School case study. Angela has also been a McKinsey management consultant and for 5 years a math teacher in the public schools of San Francisco, Philadelphia, and New York City. So she knows what of she speaks. David Yeager is an assistant professor of developmental psychology at the University of Texas at Austin and a fellow of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, as well as I said, a fellow here at CASBS this year. He holds a BA and MED from the University of Notre Dame. That's the first time I've been able to say Notre Dame and not Notre Dame, sorry. And earned both an MA in psychology and a PhD in developmental and psychological science from Stanford University. His work focuses on psychological theories and interventions to increase student motivation and on social scientific methodology. He is a former middle school teacher and has a passion for using experimental research to create educational equality. So join me in welcoming Angela and David.
Really a pleasure. I won't waste time thanking you at length, but thank you for having me. As mentioned, I came to the career that I have in psychology really through the classroom. I mean, we've all been through the classroom, but I also went through the classroom as a teacher. And I just want to say quite simply, the insights that brought me to this program of research were very simple. A, kids are pretty smart. Yep, they are really good at learning things. And even the students who are not doing so well, I would just say in my classes, the students who were not doing so well, if you sit next to them and talk to them about things they do care about, like, pretty smart. So that was one just insight, like, oh, didn't know that you know, most, all the kids actually that I taught were fairly bright children, in my view. And then the second thing was, yeah, math. Lots of things that kids have to learn. Math, grammar, writing a nice paragraph. Hard, yeah, definitely hard, but not beyond their intellectual ken. I just felt that so much of, you know, culture and the messages that kids were encoding were like, oh, who's smart enough to learn this? I was thinking about, like, who's smart to learn, like, how to get X by itself on the left side of this equation? Like, pretty much all of you. And I began to think that it wasn't an intellectual capacity problem that was explaining primarily American underachievement and the underachievement of these particular kids who were sitting in the seats in front of me. So I wanted to understand the psychology of effort, and that brought me to psychology, not so that I could castigate children or point fingers or blame, but so I could truly understand, like, why do people work hard? What is it like to work hard? When do we work hard and when do we not work hard? So, you know, I'll tell you particularly about one aspect of psychology, one aspect among others that I think does bear on how much work kids are going to put forward to their academics or to anything else they care about. I stole this from the New York Times website, but, you know, I'm sure I have their blessing. And why is it on the website? I think it's because there is something resonant, maybe the word, it's very onomatopoeic, like grit, it sounds gritty, I guess. This is what I mean by grit, and I think there is a resonance here. I think when I talk to coaches and pastors and rabbis and teachers and parents and uncles and aunts and astronauts and other folks who really resonate with this idea that this construct is important, I think it's because there is this realization that many things in life require you to work at it for extended periods of time with interest and effort, and the goal in you know, whatever it is that you care about is so distant that it might take you months, years, and in some cases even longer. So this idea is just resonant, I think, across a lot of things. In particular, I have a soft spot for children, but I also think that it bears on probably everything that the people in the room here do. So here's a very simple diagram that leaves out all the social, political, poverty factors that I think must influence children's learning and their effort. I study grit because I'm a psychologist. I was hanging around with some sociologically trained sociologists today at lunch, and I realized that, very obviously this is an incomplete picture of what's going on, but it's a start, and I do want to understand the psychology of the kid. Are the grittier students, working harder? Are they accumulating more high quality time on task than others? And if so, in particular, why are they doing that? And my view is that, in particular, gritty people do two things. They show up, which Woody Allen told us long ago is 80% of success in life. Just be there. Just keep being there. And after they show up, they do this thing called daily deliberate practice. Now, I'm really interested in my work, and I'll say very little bit about this, but just, David and I want to tease you into a conversation, which is the last half of our time together. I think that when children or grown-ups decide to, do things that are hard over long stretches of time, they do things essentially based on the expected costs and benefits. That's right. I pretty much think kids are rational agents. I know that's very unpopular to think of people as rational these days, but I think at some level, deeply, people are fairly sane, including children who are driving you crazy at the moment. But in their heads, something must be going on that makes their behavior sensible to them. And now, of course, we have to understand what it is that's going on when it doesn't make sense to us. Now, what I mean by deliberate practice is nicely summarized by this graph, not from my own research, but from the work of Anders Ericsson. Pretty much everyone in the room has read or heard of Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and I will say that the work on deliberate practice, thousands and thousands of hours of this special kind of practice, is not Gladwell's own idea. But in fact, shocker, a scientist named Anders Ericsson who studies experts. And in his study of experts in as diverse fields as you can think of, from Sudoku to soccer, he finds that there's a skill curve, so skills on the vertical axis, and what he's graphed here is years of deliberate practice on the x-axis. You really only have a chance at world-class levels of performance, that's the dotted horizontal line, after you've accumulated thousands and thousands of hours over years and years of this kind of practice. There's nothing magic about the number 10,000 except for that it's round, and it was one average in one study, but I think the generalized insight is that getting really good at anything, anything, being a chef or a mathematician, does take a tremendous amount of work over time. And in particular, when Anders studies experts, he finds that they practice in a very particular way, which he dubs deliberate practice. They do all four of these things at once. They're working on something very self-conscious and specific that they cannot yet do. So they have set out to do what they cannot do. They concentrate completely, true, full 100% concentration. They get immediate and informative feedback. So for example, Olympic downhill skiers have themselves videotaped, and as soon as they can, they get their hands on the videotape and they watch it so they can then learn on what to do a little differently the next time. And then finally, they practice to fluency. My husband's a former violist, like as in he played viola in college, and then he went back to take viola lessons, and he came home one day and he said, his viola teacher said that he had to play this single piece that he had been assigned, right? 10 times flawlessly before he would be given the next viola piece. And I thought to myself, oh, right, that's how experts practice. Not to B+, not to kind of get it, but truly to complete fluency and automaticity. And what does it feel like to do deliberate practice? I love this essay that Martha Graham wrote towards the end of her career for National Public Radio. She says, it takes about 10 years to make a mature dancer, right? So again, nothing magic about 10 years or 10,000 hours, but it does come up again and again, it's true. She says, dancing appears glamorous, easy, and delightful, but the path to the paradise of achievement is not easier than any other. There is fatigue so great that the body cries even in its sleep. There are times of complete frustration. There are daily, small deaths. This is what it feels like to do deliberate practice, at least according to one very great artist. It's not always that bad, but when we went to the National Spelling Bee, we wanted to know what kids were doing and how it felt. So we had them keep diaries of the kinds of things that they did, and they listed all sorts of things, and they kept track of not only how it felt in terms of its effort and its enjoyment, but also how many hours and minutes they were doing. And here's our data. So there's 3 bars in each cluster. The dark bars are doing deliberate practice. Things like writing the same word over and over again, singly down a page. In the middle, on the light bars, is being quizzed, like your mom might say Usprache, and you say U-S-P-R-A-C-H-E, Usprache, which was the winning word that year, and which I just learned how to spell, by the way. And then what they really want to do all day is what we coded as leisure verbal activities, mostly reading, right, which kids actually in the study rated as enjoyable as eating ice cream. So super enjoyable things in some cases, high effort things in it, but in the picture that we're painting here is not that unlike Martha Graham's description of low enjoyment, high effort for deliberate practice. But when you throw everything into the same model and you ask, in terms of time, which kind of practice uniquely predicts spelling bee performance in the finals, it's only deliberate practice. And grit was the best psychological predictor of how much time kids spent. Now, some of us may have children in the room or grandchildren or nieces, nephews. I just want to point out one thing. Being quizzed is actually a very good thing for studying, in part because you can identify what you don't know, but then of course you have to go and practice it, and that might be why in this model it falls out as not being super predictive. So do quiz your children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, but also recognize that there's a certain amount of practice that they have to do with full concentration, working on something they can't, with feedback, repetitively, in order for them to improve. Now, I want to transition to this expected value idea, this idea that kids are, in a way, little economists trying to figure out how they should optimize their benefits and minimize their costs. We created an intervention which simply taught kids what I just explained to you. We told them, Martha Graham hates to practice, says it kind of feels like dying, completely frustrated sometimes, totally confused. We spice it up, with cartoons, which are more fun to look at than me. We also tell them that if you look at scientific studies of kids and adults learning, the signature emotion of learning is not flow. It is not necessarily even curiosity or happiness or pride. The signature emotion of learning seems to be confusion. It is confusion which you have to sustain in this concentrated way that you don't enjoy, because confusion is a negative emotion, and that we should maybe reinterpret the experience of studying and homework as something which is normal and also potentially even a good sign, like I'm in my discomfort zone. Kids at the end, this is very Dweckian, I would say, have this exercise at the end where they write a letter to another student where they simply summarize what they've learned and actually tell a story from their own life that brings it to life. So for example, on the far right, dear student, deep practice helps me a lot with soccer. It makes me a better player. I used to be the one that was behind on my team, but now that I use deep practice, I'm one of the top players. It makes me frustrated, but I push through it with hard work, and that equals success, right? So we created a task that forced kids to do deliberate practice. We took Khan Academy material, but we increased the algorithm so that kids would be constantly pushed into doing problems that they were actually getting a certain percentage of them wrong. But when we sat them in the lab, we said, if you need to take a break, whenever you want to, you can go. We have negotiated with your school to take off the firewall. You can go to YouTube, you can go to Facebook, you can go to Instagram. We were like the most popular study that has ever been run, because kids never get to do that in their own computer labs. And this is a screenshot of one of our studies. And you can kind of see that some of the kids are on Instagram, and then some of the kids are actually on the task itself, this deliberate practice task. And what we found is that learning about deliberate practice compared to a placebo control group actually can, I would say, either you could say in the red line, increase the amount of deliberate practice kids are willing to do relative to a control group, or at least mitigate against the decrease, right? That the control group is like, oh, I really don't want to do this, and we're sort of buffering against that in the intervention group. We also change their beliefs about practice. Once you go through this intervention, you say things like, you know what, when you're doing your homework and you're studying, you should focus on weaknesses and things that you don't know and stop repeating all the things that you do know, which of course feels better. And also their beliefs about frustration. What is frustration? A sign that you should give up and, like it's over, or a sign that you should actually persist because this might be the real moment of learning. And I will say finally that we're excited that among the lower achieving students, which is a finding that I think David and I and Carol and many others of us who are all in the kind of Carol Dweck extended family, we often find that there is a kind of bringing up of the most vulnerable students in these interventions, and in this case we find that. So for example, in the high achieving kids there's no effect on grades, but in the low achieving kids there is an increase in the intervention group. And finally, I'll just say for my own self that I want to give the credit for the intervention work completely to my graduate student, Lauren, and then our funders, and also David, who, among other people, just selflessly tells me what the heck I'm doing wrong when we call him and ask him to look at our interventions. So let me transition to you, David. Thanks.
I'm a developmental psychologist, but much of my training is in social psychology. And a hallmark in social psychology is the idea that the situation, the setting you're in, provides information to you about the kind of person you might be viewed as, what's worth your effort, what is the meaning of your actions and your behavior in this setting in the eyes of others. And so where we build on the story that Angela developed is to try to look at an even earlier level in the diagram to say, what are the discernments that individuals make as they enter a setting? That this is a place where I can trust that my effort will be valued and will pay off in this setting. Is this a place where I belong, where people will respect me, where when I push myself to the, as Claude Steele says, to the frontiers of my ability and put myself out there where I might look dumb, I might look like someone who lacks ability, that it's a safe place for me to invest my efforts. And so where I love where this work comes together is the idea that there's a particular type of practice that develops ability, but it takes trust that that unpleasant feeling, that frustration, the judgment you make about that aversive emotion, is it worth it to me from my perspective, given what I know about the setting? And this is a long tradition of research that builds. Angela's a co-author in some of this, but certainly a lot of my collaborators, either at Stanford or from Stanford. And the work I'll present is really, it grows out of a number of wonderful people in their work. What's a good setting to test the psychology of effort, specifically your judgments of whether you can trust that this is a safe place? Well, I'm a former middle school English teacher, and I would assign writing assignments, and every Sunday I would get, or every few Sundays, I'd get the drafts, the essays that the kids wrote. And I'd go to this coffee house, Shades of Brown in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it was before Shades of Gray, so it was less weird at the time. And I'd sit there, and anyway, I would grade essays, and I just had this stack, and I just hated it, right? It's just such an aversive experience for me. And I just listened to the high schoolers chit-chat about the boring stuff that they're doing and whatever. And I'm just, just like drinking coffee. And the thing that comforted me was these kids are so lucky because every comment I put on their essay, they're going to get so much better at writing. How fortunate that I went out of my way to tell them how they could improve. I'm just going to get thank you note after thank you note when they get essays back. And they look like this, right? And that's kind of our theory of getting good teachers in the classroom that really push kids, the kids are gonna love it. But from the kids' perspective, what are they saying, right? And they look a little bit like this guy. They're thinking, this is if you Google first batch of comments on your dissertation proposal, this image comes up. It's the first thing. That's actually true. From their perspective, they're like, this guy went out of his way on a Sunday just to crap on all my work. And like, what a horrible person, right? And so there's this intersubjectivity problem, right? Where like their effort, from their perspective, is viewed as just this complete lack of competence by an authority figure. And absent trust that if they try their hardest, that they're going to meet a standard and be treated fairly, why would it be rational from their perspective to not play with their friends at night, but instead revise an essay? And so this is work that grew out of Jeff Cohen's dissertation, and we carried out a study also with Val Purdy-Vaughan's, where this is a real essay from the study where middle schoolers wrote essays about their heroes. This was designed to be a self-relevant topic. And we instructed the teachers to do their best on providing comments. And you know, I was an English teacher. You're told to do something to buffer your critical feedback. And now you can ask yourself, well, how do you give critical feedback? And I talk to a lot of parents and teachers, and they say, I'll tell you how you give critical feedback. Step 1, give someone a compliment about something that's completely unrelated to the domain you're about to talk about, like their enthusiasm. Step 2, tell them that all their work is bad and tell them all the ways that it could be revised. Step 3, remind them of their competence in some completely unrelated domain, like their taste in music or their shoes. But the assumption is that like self-esteem is a cup, that you take a gulp and you fill it up a little bit with a compliment, you take a gulp with a critical feedback, and then don't forget to fill it back up again at the end. But subjectively, from the perspective of the kid, they may not be wondering, like, do I have high self-esteem? But they may be wondering, is this person viewing me as an idiot or as someone who has no competence? And if you don't create a trust that this is a place where your abilities and perspectives are valued, it can be difficult to make a judgment of that this is worth my effort. So what teachers did is they kind of intuitively knew to use the compliment sandwich approach. And they're like, this is really good job. And then, it's lots of substantive feedback. And by professional development standards, this is great feedback on essays. But then what happened is after the kids wrote the first essay, and then the teachers commented on it, the researchers intercepted the essays, and we randomly assigned Post-it notes on the essays, designed to assuage the concern that this teacher views you only in light of a negative stereotype, for instance, or in light of as someone who lacks ability. And this is a technique developed by Claude Steele and Jeff Cohen called wise feedback. And what it does is it has two parts of the message. First, an invocation of high standards. That I'm giving you these comments because I have high standards. And the idea is to take off the table the alternative attribution that you're being criticized because of bias or dislike. But just appealing to a high standard doesn't assure a person that they have the potential to meet it. It's like going to the Astroworld, that's in Houston, Six Flags, and you see the thing. You have to be this big to write. That's the standard, but you're this tall, and you're never going to meet it. And you wonder, well, who developed that standard? And so the idea is to both appeal to the high standard and then say, I'm with you to the bitter end until you reach that high standard. And so the note said, I'm giving you these comments because I have high standards and I know that you can meet them. It's a simple sentence, but it comes directly from observational work of the world's best teachers. Jaime Escalante, the movie Stand and Deliver, that's a real story of a real teacher. And he said, this is the standard for AP Calculus, and we're studying in my living room until midnight, until everyone here passes that. We try to invoke that spirit. For kids in the control condition, they got a note that said, I'm giving you these comments so you have feedback on your essay, which conveys no information. However, some beautiful work by Ellen Langer shows us that any explanation for behavior that grammatically sounds correct can have a beneficial effect. And so it's truly titled a placebo, and there's the footnote. It's a beautiful set of studies. If you want to cut in line at the copier, for instance, if you just say, I'd like to make my copies, can I cut in line? People are like, no, it's ridiculous. You're a jerk and you're selfish. If you say, can I cut in line? I'm in a hurry. I need to pick up my kids at soccer practice. Then it's like, oh, right away. I would be a jerk if I stood in your way. But in the third condition, if you say, can I cut in line? I'd like to make my copies faster. Then you're just as likely to get compliance. And it took you a second to laugh because grammatically it sounds like an explanation. And conveys it fulfills a conversational norm. And so here too, we said like just something that kids wouldn't question. And in fact, we knew through follow-up surveys and interviews that kids didn't question this. Okay, so researchers intercept the essays, append the post-it notes randomly assigned at the individual level in real 7th grade classrooms at a racially diverse middle school. 50% of students are white, 50% of students were African American, but all teachers were white. So we're looking at trust across the racial divide in the face of critical feedback. Essays had a cover page put on them, so teachers were blinded to the treatment condition. They handed back the essays, kids walk out the door, and then a week later, they either revise the essay or not. And so what happened? On the y-axis here is the percent of kids who revised the essay in the real middle school classroom. And what you see is that in the control condition, in the placebo, you see a racial achievement gap that unfortunately is reproduced on a number of metrics again and again in many American classrooms. And absent this type of social psychological perspective, absent a perspective on the legitimate concerns that students might have about whether it's fair to trust in this setting, you might wonder, are these kids different? Are there traits that differ? Is this the fixed state of affairs? However, for kids who received the high standards and assurance post-it note, white students showed a marginally significant, modest benefit of around 25 percentage points, but for African American students, there was a dramatic increase in the proportion who revised their essays, up to 72%. Statistically, this eliminates the achievement gap on this metric in this moment. And what's important about this is that what can seem like a stable set of findings again and again can in fact be a legitimate discernment that an individual might have about whether this place is safe for me to trust that my effort will be valued and respected by the authorities. This is at the end of the 7th grade year, at a time when we knew trust was declining. Just as in Angela's data, people wanted less deliberative practice over time. In this data set, we surveyed kids twice a year on their trust, their beliefs that teachers were fair. In the control condition, it looked like this. Every single measurement occasion, especially African American students, showed lower trust. In the treatment condition, there was still a decline, but that decline leveled off after the post-it note throughout the 8th grade year. From official records, at the end of the school year in 8th grade, we looked at discipline incidents. And the reason for this is this finding. It grows in part out of some theory that Jennifer Eberhardt, who's here, has developed, that individuals discern whether institutions are fair. Is this a place where the policies are applied fairly to me and specifically to my group? And that discernment, once developed, might apply across domains of interaction. So in this school, we know, for instance, that African American students are aware that they're more likely to, for instance, be stopped in the hallway and ask for a hall pass as compared to white students. That type of discernment in turn predicts whether they revise their essay in the classroom. But it also predicts whether they earn discipline incidents in 8th grade, net of whether they were disciplined themselves previously. And so if trust is this mediator, if individuals form a mental model of trust based on interpersonal treatment, then that might create the very reality that students might have perceived. That is, students now distrusting may act out against those very rules that they see as unfair and unjust. However, if trust could be restored, in fact, the reality is ambiguous. If you could lead students to see this as a place where perhaps, maybe, sometimes, I might be treated fairly, then perhaps you could prevent some of that discipline. And in fact, that's what we find. Where in the control condition, you see a dramatic racial disparity in discipline, consistent with what was perceived by individuals. However, for kids who received the post-it note, there was about a 50% reduction in the discipline incidents. Note that this is different teachers, a different school year, and this is, in many cases, outside of the classroom. So there's this dynamic interplay between discernments of trust in the classroom and discernments of fairness of the institution that you're a part of. Now, in turn, trust in this study predicted whether students made it to college 4 years later. But what we were interested in is whether these mental models of wariness about fairness and belonging might still be malleable even later in development. For instance, among individuals who are transitioning from high school into college. So what I'll end with is a study we worked closely with Greg Walton, who's here, where we've thought about this idea where a student's belief or a mindset that is the product of experience might predict their everyday behaviors, whether they feel it's safe to invest their effort or not. Over time, that might lead to differences in learning, achievement, and in turn reinforce a mindset that they may have. That is, that perception becomes a reality, what Tim Wilson calls an exacerbation cycle. But you might be able to cut that through psychological intervention of the type that were developed here at Stanford. And so we did some work in the transition to college, which is what I'll end with. And specifically, we looked at graduates of high-performing urban charter networks. These are students from communities where the base rate of college enrollment and subsequent graduation is very low. However, these schools helped students develop skills, academic skills, and gain admission to college, in many cases at around 100% rates. But the college graduation rate among those students, that 100% who made it to college, ranges from 20 to 40%. So there's this tragic loss of potential among individuals coming out of, in many cases, low-income communities, in many cases, first-generation students, in many cases, students of color, who head off to our nation's colleges, but never earn degrees and leave with debt. So we wondered if helping students appraise early experiences of difficulty, that first critical feedback on your freshman seminar essay, and probably everyone in this room remembers your first freshman seminar, like, anyone willing to share those? I'm not. Right? That first calculus test you might have failed, the first time that's academic. What about social? The first time you have lunch with someone and then you know that they go to a party the next day and they don't invite you. Those are all experiences where you might legitimately wonder, is this a normal part of the transition to college, or is this due more generally to something about my group, that people like me may not belong, may not be valued here? And that, again, that discernment about belonging may in turn affect whether you feel like it's a safe place for you to put yourself to the frontiers of your abilities, the frontiers of your knowledge, to be lost, confused, to struggle, to ask questions in front of peers, whether you worry they might think that you're dumb. And so with Greg and Angela, we had a design school day here at the Stanford Design School. We're trying to bring the fun of product design methodology into the design of psychological interventions. That's Anders Ericsson, who came for that day, and there's Angela, someone from Angela's staff, Chris Gabrielli, Donald Commence, one of our partners from Yes Prep Public Schools, Chris Broughton. And what we did is we interviewed a ton of students, graduates of urban charters who are transitioning to college, and we tried to craft a message that could just help them have a little psychological space before they face inevitable difficulties. We had students draw what we called a journey map. This is a journey of their transition from high school to college. You see stress, stress, stress in the admissions process. This student went to CSU East Bay and then dropped out after 1 month for a financial matter, going back to college. This is a young woman that Claude Steele and I interviewed. It told stories of worries that professors didn't care nearly as much as her teachers in high school, and wondered if that meant that they weren't valuing her, respecting her. Building on this kind of design process, we took a series of notes. We worked with a D-School for several months and rewrote materials that just help students have a little space to potentially interpret early common difficulties as things that might be able to overcome, as a place, see college as a place where they might trust. We then distilled all these insights into a very brief web-based survey. It takes about 25-30 minutes to complete. And students went to their school computer labs and they completed it in May of senior year in high school. So it says you're finishing high school, you're going to college, you're excited, you probably still have lots of questions about what to expect, et cetera, et cetera. And then they read a series of quotes that were taken from the real members of our focus groups and interviews, talking about how college is hard. You're gonna struggle in school, you're gonna struggle socially, but over time you get better. These are kids taking the survey. They're randomly assigned at the individual level. From their perspective, all the materials look very similar. They read these quotes. Again, it takes about 20 to 25 minutes. From their perspective, the study is over at the end. And then we track them through the National Student Clearinghouse, which is a government database that allows you to know whether people are enrolled full-time in college or not. And so on the y-axis here is full-time enrollment rates. We did this 2 years in a row and replicated in two different charter management organizations. One is in Philadelphia, almost exclusively African-American students. And the other is in Houston, Texas, almost exclusively Latino students. So what you see is that in the control, tragically, although 100% were admitted to college, only 61% show up in the fall. So there's what's called summer melt. Our treatment doesn't stop summer melt, really. But even more tragically, you see that even among the students who made it to the first semester of college, you lose an additional half by fall of junior year, and this is the most recent data. For the treatment, though, you see a slowing of that decline. The pipeline is less leaky for these students. And it may not look like much, but by spring of sophomore year, there's a 12 percentage point increase in full-time enrollment rates for students from this one-time message with no reinforcement. And it's significant at every time point after the first year. In cohort 2, what you see is that, again, 100% were admitted to college. Tragically, only 51% made it. And then they lose about 10% over the first year and a half of college. But by the fall of sophomore year, there's a significant treatment contrast. And importantly, the size of the effects may look modest, but they're big from the perspective of social science. So a flagship intervention that paid students $3,500 per semester for staying full-time students had an effect of around 2 to 2.4 percentage points, and it faded out after 1 year. These effects are much larger, and they can be achieved at much more modest cost. So in summary, what I'd like to suggest is that sometimes some of the withholding of effort that some students, especially across group lines, that we might see, may be due to a legitimate questioning of whether this is a fair place where I could trust and where I can succeed. And then allowing students to stay in the game just long enough where they can have some success, where it can build on itself, can have surprising effects that can last and that can reinforce themselves over time. And so in conclusion, I think what Margaret is leading here at the center is really integrative behavioral science that takes basic scientific ideas and thinks of ways to use them to address important social problems. And all of the work I presented here builds on great work by CASBS Fellows, people like Claude Steele. And so I'm really excited to see the kinds of effects that we can have on important social problems going forward from the kinds of work that CASBS Fellows this year and next year will be doing. Thank you very much.